It's my pleasure to introduce to you our plenary speaker for this evening, Professor Jeffrey Bishop. He's Professor of Philosophy and Theological Studies at St. Louis University, and he holds the Tenet Chair in Healthcare Ethics. Bishop's scholarly work draws on philosophy, theology, ethics, and medicine, and is focused on the historical, political, and philosophical conditions that underpin contemporary medical and scientific practices and theories. And I suspect that most of us, or many of us, will be familiar with Professor Bishop from his superb book, The Anticipatory Corpse, which was published in 2011. This is a wide-ranging interdisciplinary text of extraordinary breadth and depth, and it draws on a mixture of narrative, Foucauldian analysis, and theological and philosophical metaphysics to explore and critique modern understandings of dying and death. And it's just a fantastic book, so for those who haven't read it, I'd encourage you to perhaps leave immediately and go and do so.
I hear his best contribution to medicine is it's a cure for insomnia.
The other thing I'll just briefly mention, so tonight's lecture's been sponsored by a project that a few of us here are involved in, Christian Flourishing in a Technological World. This is essentially a network of scholars, philosophers, theologians, and some working in other disciplines, looking at the impact of technology on what it means to be human. And it's funded by the Issachar grant. If you want to find out more about the project, you can go to www.christianflourishing.com or speak to Jens Zimmerman, who's one of the investigators for that. The paper that Professor Bishop will be presenting to us tonight is entitled Aging and the Technological Imaginary, Living and Dying in the Age of Perpetual Innovation. So please join me in welcoming our presenter.
Thanks for having me. On July 30th, I got some really terrible news. I found out that a man that I loved and respected killed his wife and then killed himself. Their son was a high school classmate of mine. Robert and Gloria had been married for 53 years. Gloria had been diagnosed with some sort of brain tumor and was having a good amount of pain. Together they had decided to end Gloria's life. Robert decided to end his life rather than to go to age alone, waiting alone for his own death. I knew Robert much better than I did Gloria. Robert was the principal, the headmaster of the local middle school, and he became the superintendent for the state schools in that small city, my hometown in Texas. They were a beautiful couple, kind, generous, loving toward each other. Gloria was quick to smile, quick to see the best in people. Robert was a firm educator and disciplinarian, but he was fair and kind at the same time. Whenever you spoke to him, you felt as if he genuinely cared about you. Everyone respected them and everyone respected him. In fact, it is hard for me to call him Robert in this paper because I knew him as Mr. Haas. We knew him as this towering figure, not because he demanded any sort of respect, but because of his character. Though I did not see him as often after I grew up and left home, at sporting events I would run into him in school or walking along the streets in our small town. We would stop on the sidewalk and talk for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. He was curious about the work I did. And when I talked with him, he made it feel like I was the most important person in the world. To hear this tragic news cut me deeply. I was tearful whenever I thought of Robert and Gloria, their son, my friend, and their grandchildren. Robert was not a rash man. He was not given to emotional reaction or action. I cannot really imagine him doing this at all. It's just really incomprehensible. No one in our little city could. His love for Gloria was so deep and earnest, and he did not have a violent bone in his body. But it shakes me to my core to ponder the depth of despair that must that such a man of deep character and virtue must have felt such that he could be driven to do such a thing. The report in one of the local newspapers added insult to injury. The paper was not my hometown newspaper, but a paper from a neighboring city. They covered the piece with some matter-of-fact details, which is what you would expect. The journalist reported these facts as given to him by the local authorities, and yet in the fourth paragraph, the reporter began to interview the founder of Texas Death with Dignity, an advocacy group focused on changing the laws in Texas that would permit patients to end their lives legally. The article was 23 paragraphs long. 11 of the 23, right at half, were devoted to an apology for the right to die, for the right to be legally killed. I was outraged that the people from my hometown, all those who loved Robert and Gloria, were reading this instead of reading about Robert and Gloria. They were reading a thinly veiled apology for assisted death or state-sanctioned suicide. I was puzzled by the fact that assisted killing, legalized euthanasia, state-sanctioned suicide, whatever we want to call it, was the interpretive frame for Robert's and Gloria's death. Could the frame have been something else, like the lack of palliative care in rural Texas, or perhaps something like the fact that elderly people living in rural parts of the world are often isolated from friends and family? Or perhaps the frame could have been the failure of the local parish to truly care for Robert and Gloria, or perhaps the way in which radical individualism that plagues my home state of Texas becomes toxic, making it impossible for Robert to ask for help. Why was legalized suicide the frame? Why was it obvious that Robert should have been allowed to kill himself, according to the Texas Death with Dignity people, and then to kill himself? To have himself killed legally. Why were Robert's and Gloria's lives reduced to this frame? In what follows, I will not address Robert's or Gloria's death in particular. I do not wish to judge them. I love them, and I trust in God's providence that all will be well for them. However, I will speculate on the way that death, particularly suicide, has become the horizon against which living and dying, that is to say, the way that aging is understood. I will argue that technology, or what I will call modern technics, creates a temporal horizon that brings self-death, suicide, as the most reasonable of choices. Modern technology, the logic of techne, brings one to the logical conclusion that death is the most reasonable of answers. It does so for two reasons. The first, I will argue, is that technology shapes cultural temporality, because the temporal horizon is perpetual innovation, a sense that death can be deferred perpetually. Thus, the logic of technique shapes the way time is perceived, the way meaning is made or is not made, or is at least made differently. It promises a seemingly open-endedness to time that leaves one swimming in indeterminacy. But death is not indeterminate. Second, the logic of modern technique shapes the moral subjectivity of human actors, elevating the will to choose, the will to power, to exert godlike power in one's choosing one's own death. And finally, I will conclude with a different form of what I will call technics, or liturgics, specifically divine liturgy as an ars moriendi par excellence, as a technique for living. Waiting for death. A theologian friend recently said to me, my mother told me that all there is left for her to do is to just wait on death. Her mother, now in her 80s, was not actively dying. She was just old, living mostly independently in an assisted living facility. My theologian friend went on to say that it seemed to her that all of our cultural responses in the past were focused on death as an event. The funeral was designed for those who were left behind. We don't know how to deal with death as a process, she said. What we need is a new ars moriendi, a new art of dying. I think my friend is mostly correct. She is correct on at least 2 points. First, there were a lot more sudden deaths at younger ages before the rise of contemporary medicine. So it makes sense that our cultural and theological resources are not aimed at helping us to live with aging as a process, a kind of winding down of life. Her mother was just waiting, and in a way longing for death to arrive. My friend, secondly, is also correct that our ministries to elderly are woefully lacking. Christian churches tend to do a good job with ministries to children and to young families and to teenagers, but they do a bad job when it comes to caring for the extremely old. Where I think my theologian friend gets it a bit wrong is her call for an up-to-date ars moriendi. Let me say what I mean by that. The problem is that we already have a contemporary cultural ars moriendi that I'm going to say is created by this technological imaginary. Yet I will argue that it's not actually an ars moriendi, an art of dying, so much as it is an ars ad mortem, a technique toward death. Let me explain what I mean by ars moriendi. And you all know what the ars moriendi was. The ars moriendi, I'm just going to speak freely here because I've got too much written. You cut it up a little bit. The ars moriendi, of course, came about in response to the plague in the 15th century. People were dying left and right. Parish priests were dying. No one was there to minister to the dying. And so these were booklets that were given, and they helped prepare people to meet their Maker. And they're prepared for people who you pretty much find out you've got about 7 to 10 days once you start having the fever. Okay, 7 to 10 days of living. So these are people who are in the active process of dying. So the ars moriendi is really more of an acute sort of process that one has to go through. It's more designed for somebody like Gloria, who knew her death was close, than it was for Robert, right? So it had a certain kind of function. But there's also something about the way that death captures one's attention. I often say to my students, if I told you tomorrow you were going, or tonight you were going to die, you probably wouldn't stay and listen to my very stimulating lecture, would you? And of course, it captures your attention when you know that. Suddenly the world is perceived a little bit differently. Time is perceived differently once you're facing your death. This is, of course, an insight that Martin Heidegger built an entire philosophy around, this idea of the knowledge of one's death, which serves as a horizon for living life authentically, according to Heidegger. Each of us is not merely a transcendental subject with its a priori forms of the intuition, space and time, that shape our experience of the world. Rather, Heidegger immanentizes time. Time becomes immanentized and highly particularized. We are beings. I am a being thrown into a history, a family, a country, not of my own choosing, and a history that I have not myself lived. The beginning of my time is not really mine, yet it holds sway over me. The end of my time is my own death, but it too is not something that I will experience as my own, for I will not be there to experience it. So this horizon of the past and a future of my death shapes time for my being, right now, in this moment, living. For Heidegger, then, to live authentically is to own, in the present, the abyss of the beginning and the end of time, of my death, and to bring those into existence for my living now, letting them shape my projects and my purposes and my meanings. Heidegger, of course, had a lot more to say in Being in Time, but for our purposes, the horizon of death, the end of my time, shapes what each person takes to be important for living, her projects, her purposes, and the meaning of her life. Yet for our technological era, death seems far off. Why is it so important for us? Why is it so different for us in the technological era? The answer is obvious, and I think the obvious answer, I think, is the most simplistic of answer. And that answer is that we have a compression of morbidity and mortality due to the technological advances. We are not presented with our deaths or failing health until we are very near death. Death is deferred because technology keeps us alive longer. It does not often enter into our minds and thus does not shape our being. Yet this fact alone does not tell us why the meaning of death, and therefore the meaning of living, and therefore the meaning of aging, leads to this kind of emptiness that so many feel at the end of their lives, such that they feel they are just waiting on death, and in waiting on it, it is unbearable. Something deeper and broader is at work, I think. And I'm going to unpack what I think that is and argue that modern technics shapes the temporal horizon, and thus what is possible for us to imagine about the purpose and meaning of my life becomes constricted and constrained. And I will call this the technological imaginary. The next section I call technical objects, technical apparatuses, and technological imaginary. In his book, Technics and Time, Bernard Stiegler sheds light on the way that technology, or rather technical objects, what he calls modern technics, shape our being. Contrary to Heidegger, who argued that temporality is the result of a historical inheritance of the past that I have not lived, that projects me forward into a future I shall not live, Stiegler claims that it is only through technicity, language, books, arts, works of art, machines, modern science, technics, it's only through technics or technicity that I have access to the past as it projects me into my future. One of Stiegler's most important points is the way that technical objects shape the temporal horizon of human beings. Following the work of a historian of technology, Bertrand Gill, Stiegler states, quote, "Industrial civilization rests on an ever more intense development of the process of permanent innovation. It results in a divorce, if not between culture and techniques, at least between the rhythms of cultural evolution and the rhythms of technological evolution." In other words, it is not simply that death is deferred in modern technological life. Rather, the temporal horizon made possible by permanent innovation is expanded beyond the human capacity to imagine one's own being because of the open-endedness, the indeterminacy of modern life. There is no sense of the end of time, and thus no way for my projects, purposes, and meanings to emerge. Technics evolves more rapidly than culture, disrupting the way that human being is imagined. At the cultural scale, then, rather than death shaping the projects, purposes, and meanings of a human life, modern technicity, the open-endedness of an indeterminate future, leaves the human without bearings for the directions of her life. Whereas Heidegger had argued that my death, the end of my time, shapes the temporal horizon. In the modern technical world, it is not merely that death is deferred, but rather that permanent technological innovation gives a kind of horizonlessness, openness, that leads to an emptiness, resulting in a kind of meaninglessness of one's projects and purposes. A second point that Stiegler brings into relief for our purposes is that technological beings disrupt the way that we imagine the world. In the history of the West, we have preferred to think of beings as two different kinds, living beings on the one hand, and non-living beings, inert beings, on the other. And thus we have relegated technical beings into the realm of this non-living side. So we believe that we have reign over these inert, non-living beings, these technologies, that we wield godlike power over them. Still, while technical beings are artificial, they are not merely inert things. Even though they are non-living beings, technological beings, machines, or even scientific projects, still have a kind of tendency, a directedness akin to living beings. They are designed to act in accord with human will and intention. Thus, they are not merely inert. But there is another dimension to them as well. They have their own tendencies. once we build them. The more advanced artificial, non-living technical beings have intentions and purposes, teloi, built into them that push in directions beyond what they were ever intended to do. They are thus distinct from natural, non-living beings because they contain something of agency, albeit a different kind of human agency from human purpose and intention. Or as Peter Paul Verbeek notes, they have morality built into them. Thus, in a way, technical beings have a kind of agency, but also a kind of freedom, as they operate to enact automatically the historical purposes for which they were built. And these built-in tendencies begin to take on a life of their own. Now, we could look at multiple different kinds of technologies, and if I had known that Michael was going to talk about his age, what was it, your shaving cream, your age, what you don't know, his shaving cream keeps him from aging. He's 80 years old. It has a tendency to push, it's marvelous stuff. But I'm going to look at a different form of technology. We can look at multiple kinds of technologies. We can look at something like biogerontology right now as well, and see how it pushes these, it has its own tendencies built into it. But I'm going to take a more common piece of technology, the ventilator. With the ventilator, the breathing of the patient becomes an activity independent of the patient's natural biological drive to breathe. Also, the ventilator extends the practitioner's ability to keep the patient breathing. In taking over the automaticity of breathing, the machine acts independently of both the patient and the practitioner. Both because the patient is so ill and because the technological object is so complex, the patient has to be in a specialized treatment unit, the ITU or the ICU, where she can be monitored constantly, which changes the space within which the patient is cared for. Thus, the technical object, with its technical space, changes the relationship of the patient to the practitioner, and it changes the notions of agency and control. First, the practitioner becomes somewhat more marginalized. Instead of the intentionality of the physician, the intentionality of the machine operates independently of the will of the patient or the physician. Rather than the technological tool submitting to the will of the physician, the nursing staff and the physician are all on call for the machine. The machine goes beep, beep, beep. Everybody runs over to the machine, tries to figure out what's going on. There's more of a relationship between the healthcare providers and the machine and the technical space itself than there is between the healthcare providers and the patient. The practitioners are there to support the smooth functioning of the machine. Thus, operating at an implicit level, the technological object mediates a different kind of relationship between the patient and the practitioners. Moreover, the technical object also shapes the moral subjectivity of both the patient and the practitioners. The practitioner must decide whether to put the patient on the machine, and the patient must decide whether she wants to go on the machine. Both of these moral questions demand a kind of choice on the part of the patient. Do I go on the machine or not? Do I stay on the machine or not? Yet the patient is somewhat more passive before the machine, not only because she has surrendered her life over to it, but she becomes even more passive because she is often placed on medication. Inversely, the practitioners become more active, taking on more of a role, while the patient becomes more passive. Moreover, with the ventilator's moral demand that the patient make a choice, we find other apparatuses of support become essential to the relationship between the patient and the technical object. The relationship becomes more formal. The formalized relationship is ensconced in formalized processes, formalized techniques, like that of informed consent, or the patient's living will, or the patient's advance directive, which now participate in the governance of the relating of the patient to the physician and the patient to the machine. Thus, a decision made in an abstract comes to govern the concrete particulars of the case. The technical object demands a moral choice, and the moral choice demands a formalized set of social techniques that govern the moral subjectivity of both the patient and the care providers. Thus, the ritual, or rather perhaps the liturgics of informed consent, advance directives, do not attempt resuscitation orders, are born. a new set of techniques. These social techniques also mediate the relationship between the patient and the technical object and the patient and the care providers. Soon the specter of the being in the ICU or the ITU changes the way we think about medicine itself. The liturgies that surround the technical objects, the signing of the forms at the patient's arrival at the hospital, seems not to be soon enough. New demands are placed on all of us to know how we want to live our lives in relation to those technical objects. We need to begin thinking about the use of these technical objects well before we need them. We even want to create new techniques, like, I don't know if these are very popular here yet, I think I've seen them pop up a little bit, physician's orders for life-sustaining treatment, pulsed forms. They're sort of out-of-hospital do not resuscitate orders, so that if emergency technicians show up at your house and you have one of these, they won't put you through CPR. So soon the moral subjectivity of the entire technological culture of medicine comes to shape the moral subjectivity and moral agency of the culture itself. So even while we construct ventilators in the ITU and the ICU and grant them some sort of dimension of agency and freedom, they reflexively come to shape the entire moral imaginary of our being toward death, and thus our being toward aging. Even while I am not in the ITU or the ICU at this moment in my life, these techniques come to shape my own moral subjectivity, how I ponder my own living, and even my relating to my family. The technical objects and apparatuses demand social apparatuses, creating for us an entire cultural apparatus of technocratic dying. This whole social apparatus, the ventilator, the ICU, the ITU, the novel moral techniques of informed consent, living wills, advanced directives, pulse forms, and out-of-hospital DNR forms, soon transform into a set of cultural practices, call them cultural liturgies, that shape the cultural imaginary around our death. This is the technological imaginary. So what is true of the ICU and the ITU and the social apparatuses and the liturgies that enact them is true of at the larger societal level. The immediacy of all decisions, the idea that technology will not only save us, solve our problems for us, the problems of living and dying, but technology will solve even the problems created by technology. The idea that there will be a permanent innovation in all sectors of life, not just in the medical sector, but in all sectors of life. All this shapes the temporal dimension of the technological imaginary. Stiegler goes so far as to make the case that the political and economic system, it's not that the economic system is driving novel technological creation for profit, it's the other way around. It's that the technological innovation just keeps pushing and pushing, and then the economics is running to support it from behind, okay? And so is the political dimension. So he's arguing that this is a larger cultural phenomenon. I've just picked one little item out to kind of expand on it here. For our purposes, these medical techniques, these technical apparatuses shape the temporal horizon, not just because they force a choice about life and death, but because they participate in the constitution of the temporal dimension of the larger technological imaginary of a culture, leaving us in an indeterminacy and open-endedness. Yet the technological temporality of permanent innovation cannot innovate death into life. And when one has deferred death, deferred thinking about death, and then when death suddenly presents itself as inevitable, life becomes absurd. It is this technological imaginary that brings into relief the logic of taking one's own life and the absurdity of waiting for what one can achieve for oneself. Let me further unpack what I mean. The ars ad mortem, techniques toward death. These technocratic apparatuses create a kind of technocratic liturgy. One would imagine that these technocratic liturgies would bring death into relief for us, right? We're supposed to be talking about it more, such that it could operate in the way that Heidegger imagines that it would. Seemingly, one would think that following Heidegger, death would be reappropriated for authentic living when forced with the choice of living or dying. I shall have to turn to Heidegger's critique of technology in the question concerning technology to describe how that is not the case. Technology is not the ventilator, nor is it the ITU. Technology is a way of seeing, a way of taking up with reality, in much the same way that liturgy is. Technology is the logic of techne, of techniques. These techniques bring into relief certain aspects of reality, but they, at the same time, constrict and circumscribe for us what is permitted to come into relief. So technology constricts our vision as much as it opens up. And it constricts our vision, according to Heidegger, to the point where all we can see is power. Now I have to do a little Heidegger here. I'm sorry to do this to you. I really am. But Heidegger's critique of metaphysics is a critique of what he calls ontotheology. Okay? And the ontotheology, he says the metaphysical question is, what is a thing? What is a thing? And that can be answered in a couple of ways. One way of answering it is to think about the smallest bit of the thing, the smallest amount, or the single smallest unit that it shares with all other things. Right? That's the ontological part. Okay? On the other side is the theological part. It's what is the thing in its highest form of being? What is it at its pinnacle of its being? And that is the theological question. He says all through history we have these, what he calls epochs. And in one epoch you've got a certain kind of answer to the question of ontology and a certain kind of answer to the question of theology. And then we see the whole world come into relief through those bookends of an ontology and a theology. And he says that these kind of move through history, and of course they're not discrete units. They overlap and there's confusion and people argue about it. But he says for us what the ontotheology is what he calls the inframing, the technological inframing, such that when we have these bookends, on the one hand, ontology, the single most fundamental unit that we all have in common, he says, is power. This is Nietzsche. Okay? The will to power. So the Nietzschean ontotheology, the ontology part, is the single most common, the single unit that unifies everything is power. You get right down to the relationship of objects to one another, it's just power. Energy, forces, gravity, things like that. It's all power, all the way down. There isn't any more. Okay? So it's this ontological power, a power ontology, that shapes the way we think about the world through the eyes of technology. Okay? On the Nietzschean side of that, so that's the ontological thing. Think of it this way. The Big Bang, boom, everything happens, right? The sun's energy, its power. The plant's chlorophyll takes the power in, stores it, right? It's all about power. Then we, animals, fight to get that power. They try to overpower one another to get the power. And then we create power relations with each other to try to secure power and go to war, for instance, right? It's all power, all the way down. In the modern way of thinking. That's Nietzsche's power ontology. The theological moment for Nietzsche, Heidegger says, the theological moment is when this one being that has achieved a certain kind of status, a certain kind of awareness, turns to order its own becoming. That is the highest form of being for us. Okay? But there's this problem, and that toward what end if I can't further become? Well, for Nietzsche, it's just this self-aggrandizing ordering of power and making myself into what I would want to be, what I will to be, right? So it's the will to power. The problem is that the theological moment is right before death, right before you collapse back into the abyss. And so the single most important thing you can do is to own your own being, right, at the very end. So that's the Nietzschean ontotheology, which is what comes into relief for modern people through technology, according to Heidegger. So, one becomes one's own God. You build oneself up towards that pinnacle. And the most important thing you can do at the very end, when you know you're about to collapse into it, is to will to take power over your own life and to take it and to fall into that abyss under your own choice. The will to will is what that becomes. Thus, the modern technological imaginary, waiting It means being passive, not active the way Nietzsche wants us to be, not active the way technology says we must be. It means failing to become the Nietzschean god of power. Waiting is the deferral of the establishment of one's own godlikeness in willing one's death. Why not reach the highest pinnacle of the Nietzschean theology and become the God that takes its own life and returns to the abyss, the bliss of the abyss under one's own accord? The technological imaginary, with its technological objects and technical apparatus, sets out a life that must will its own existence, and in the final act it must will its own non-existence and the eternal return. Thus the technological imaginary establishes an ars ad mortem, a technique towards death, a technique towards becoming one's own God of one's own death, a technique that aims at death and elevates one to the status of a god. It is not an art of dying, but an art, a technique that creates its own God, that wills its own death. So, the next section I call the liturgic of Asclepius and the liturgy of the risen Christ. I go through the paper, I draw on the work of one of my colleagues, Kimball Cornu, who wrote a very, very, very good paper called, let me see if Asclepius Against the Crucified. Of course, he's playing off of a title of a Nietzsche, one of Nietzsche's essays, which is Dionysius Against the Crucified. And Cornu goes through and he kind of keeps unpacking. He starts to say things. He makes some really good points about Heidegger, drawing on a woman named Judith Wolff, and talking about the way in which, even for Heidegger, so Heidegger's running toward death is actually itself Nietzschean and nihilistic, is what the argument is, right? Because one is one's own God, right? Because Dasein is the being that thinks its own death, and of all the beings on the planet, the only one that can think its own death is the human, and so the human becomes God. The ontological difference between the human and the animal is contemplating one's own death, right? So even Heidegger does not escape this Nietzschean paradigm, according to people like Sean McGrath and Judith Wolff and my colleague Kimball Cornu. I won't go into that. I want to turn to a different kind of liturgy. So I'm not going to unpack Cornu's argument. Suffice it to say that Cornu offers Maximus the Confessor's reflection on creation ex nihilo as the antidote for Nietzschean power ontology. And he then unpacks the nihilism that underwrites Heidegger and Heidegger's own version of temporality. Yet creation ex nihilo is not sufficient. One's body must become one with the body of the crucified. One's body must become one with the resurrected body. And it must really do so, lest it be engaged in just some sort of philosophical theorizing. So, as Evagrius notes, true prayer is true theology. To pray is truly to do theology. And liturgy is the work of praying. And the liturgy par excellence is the Eucharist, the divine liturgy. So far, then, I've argued that there's a kind of liturgics of modern technics in which social apparatuses put before us a choice of death, creating for us our own moral subjectivity in what is an ars ad mortem, techniques toward death. We are made into gods through this activity, this power of controlling our own bodies. So I've argued that death then becomes the horizon of choice. Choosing one's death appears to be the most sensible of choices. Now I want to turn to a different kind of liturgics. Let us take divine liturgy, but let's be pretty specific about it. Let's take Advent as an example. After all, Advent is the most temporal of seasons. It is the beginning of the church year for Western Christians, but the readings are about the end times, so it's both the beginning and the end. Advent is the season that we are waiting for the Christ child, who has come, who is now coming again, and who is yet to come. So let's take a portion from one of the readings from the first Sunday of Advent from last year, from Isaiah. You, Lord, are our Father, our Redeemer. You are named forever. Why did you let us wander, O Lord, from your ways, and harden our hearts that we fear you not? So my story, in all of its particulars, becomes somewhat marginalized when God says, why do you let me wander? You start to wonder, am I wandering with all of my projects? Am I wandering and lost with my projects and purposes and meanings? Have I hardened my heart? Or has God hardened my heart because of my sins? Let's read a little further on in Isaiah. No ear has ever heard, no eye ever seen any God but you doing such deeds for those who wait for him. Would that you might meet us doing right, that we are mindful of you in our ways. If I will but wait, if I will but put aside my own rushing about with my own projects and purposes and meanings, and perhaps even my own killing of my own self, what surprises await me? What projects are not in the right, what my projects possibly are not the right projects unless I am mindful of the God as I engage in my projects. I find in these readings that the Christian cannot be the Heideggerian authentic man who wills his own life and also his own death. So I must relativize my own time in order to wait for God in God's time. Do I have ear to hear or eyes to see outside of the technological imaginary? And this from the reading of the 13th chapter of Mark, which is also for the first Sunday of Advent from last year. Jesus said to his disciples, "Be watchful, be alert. You do not know when the time will come. It is like a man traveling abroad. He leaves home and places his servants in charge, each with his own work, and orders the gatekeeper to be on the watch. Watch, therefore. You do not know when the Lord of the house is coming, whether in the evening or at midnight or at the cockcrow or in the morning. May he not come suddenly and find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to all, watch." Time is linear here. It is pressing on me. Watch now. Suddenly there is something more urgent than my projects. What am I watching for? What awaits me in the next moment that I do not know or that I do not have mastery over? Yet time is not merely linear here. In the cyclical temporality of the church year, Advent comes right before Christmas, and yet we're not reading about the coming of the Christ child, but the second coming of Christ. How often as a kid did I think in Advent, we should be reading about Jesus coming, right? As a child. But he comes as judge. That ruins my childish desires. The readings are focused on the second coming of Christ, that which is not yet, that which is still to come. Thus, at one level, the liturgy in Advent gives us the sense that time is linear. It reminds me of a past in light of which my own past must be read in anticipation of a future to which my own future must align. My own sinful past distorts my vision of the future. I'm in need of something, and yet it is not just my need, it is the need of the whole world. The whole world is longing for it, is pining for God all along. There is the present where I am now, pining in this moment for what is to come. Thus Advent is both the season of the waiting on the Christ child, but it's the Christ child's return, pointing not to the advent of death, but pointing toward the final arrival of God in the eschaton. Also, liturgy relativizes not just time, but the whole of my story, my narrative, the narrative of my past, my present, my future. It is the story of Israel, though, a past bigger than mine. It is the story of the church at this present moment, a present, my own present, that is bigger than my own present. And the hope of the New Jerusalem, a future much bigger than my own. It is all of these at once. It is the past and the future and at the same, and in this present time. There are layers upon layers of history and time, of story and of narrative. These readings about the past of Israel, the future of the New Jerusalem, are placed within the arc of divine liturgy itself. And the Eucharistic liturgy is the dramatic reenactment of the procession into Jerusalem, the crucifixion and the resurrection. Furthermore, the Eucharistic meal that we eat is itself another reenactment within the reenactment of the divine liturgy. It is the reenactment of the first Eucharist, the first Eucharistic meal celebrated by Christ before his death. And at the same time, it is the future Eucharistic meal at the triumphal banquet at the end of time. The past meal and the future meal exist in this eternally present feast. Thus, when I arrive here again in Advent, I find the Messiah has not yet come, has not yet arrived, and yet that he has already come. He was here, he is here, he will come again. I arrive at liturgy with my own sense of my own projects, the things I had hoped to bring into relief in my own particular future, and yet, in linking my projects to the past, present, and future of the one who was and is to come, I am called to realign my projects with the work that is being called forth for me by the Holy One who is to come. Whatever I am in my particular time living, whatever is weighing on me in this moment, whatever history I will have lived up to that point, whatever project I am hoping to carry out, I arrive in Advent only to find that my time is not mine. Temporality belongs to God in eternality. My time, my past, my present, my future are linked to Israel's and the future of the New Jerusalem through the mediation of the church. My story and my projects, all of my time, are themselves narratival. I must wait for God to arrive. And thus liturgy is also ahistorical, and it transects history. Thus, the work of the Christian theologian is not to sprinkle a little Christian wisdom, a little Christian morality, a little thinking onto the liturgics of the technological system. These are alternative metaphysics at work. It is certainly not the role of the Christian theologian to change Christian theology to fit, or Christian liturgy to fit the liturgies of modern technological times. The role of the Christian theologian then is to pray, such that she can become a true theologian whose world is transformed by the technics of Christian liturgy. The liturgical imaginary generated by Christian liturgy is a far cry different than the techniques of the technological imaginary of our epoch, in which death is deferred until it cannot be deferred anymore, resulting in a modern malaise of the meaningless of a life. It can only find meaning when it kills itself. Rather, we Christians must once again reenact an old ars moriendi, an old art of dying, which is really an ars vivendi. An ars vivendi is the divine liturgy itself, the art of living and the art within which aging and waiting align my projects and my purposes and my meanings with something that exceeds me. In listening to both Anthony Reddy and Susanna Snyder yesterday, I was reminded the way that liturgy changes our perception. It changes the imagination and the imaginary of what is possible. I heard Susanna say that the liturgical washing of feet changes not only my perception of the other, but how I perceive myself and how I perceive all of life. It changes who I am in the action of washing. In my action, my agency of washing feet, it reflexively changes me. And I heard Anthony Reddy saying that there are different kinds of technics, different liturgics at work in whiteness. I, the white man that I am, need to learn to see the Christ that arrives in the person of the black man and the white working class man, to see his needs and his projects, and not to see my projects of empire in him. Empire being a different kind of technics, a different liturgics. Even liturgy is that way, changing who we are so that we can perceive rightly, and so that we can say with the call to worship, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Thank you.
We have a good amount of time for questions. If you have a question, just indicate to me and I'll call on you or put you on the list.
Send the mic around.
And we're going to send the microphone around as well, so please speak into the microphone.
so I'll try to remember my name, Brian Brock. I somehow feel like I've lost the connection between ventilator as a technique and liturgy. Could you walk us through that one more time?
Yeah. So what the origin of the technique is now the machine, right? It has a different set of intentionalities that has its own temporality built into it, right? And it so far runs ahead of us that we kind of get lost in it. And so a whole set of liturgics kind of rise up around the machine, okay? And I'm arguing that there's an alternative liturgics at work in Christian theology that's prior to this that we have to recover in some way. And that liturgic is, those liturgics, those technics, those techniques of learning to see properly. Heidegger's point about technology is that it teaches you to see. It's not, this thing right here is not technology. This is a product of a way of seeing the world. And so the technology itself is a way of seeing. So it is a liturgics, but it's a different liturgics than the one that we've been given in liturgy and the person of Christ. So that's what I'm saying. It's just an alternative to the one that we have. And we lose it. We lose sight of it.
That makes sense, but why don't you then say that the ventilator is the Eucharist of technological?
Sure, I'll say that.
Right. So what's the functionality of using the secular term to name worship rather than?
Yeah, the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good question. I should probably do that, right? Yeah.
Well, that you don't points to a thing that I've heard talking about a couple times in different talks, which is this imagination point, which seems to me that it's the way we talk when we're outside on the thing we want to get into.
Yep. That's exactly right, Brian. Yeah, absolutely, guilty as charged, and I think we, but I think it's something that where's Martin? Martin and I were talking earlier. Martin said, sometimes the priest is supposed to, we were talking about being in the clinic, and he said sometimes the priest is supposed to disrupt things a bit, and then he said, except for the clinical bits. And I was just sort of like, no, maybe that's where we need to disrupt, And so in that way, I think, it's hard for chaplains who are paid by the National Health Service in the United Kingdom to be prophets to that system when they're paying the bills. But in a way, we have to become prophetic again, and that not just pastoral. The pastor has to be prophet in that moment. So yes, it has to call us back to something else, to seeing differently. I think John.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff. That was great. I'm still processing.
It's a very sensitive mind.
I'm still hung up on the ventilator.
Yeah. Sorry. Think of the aging shaving cream. That's better. That's a better one.
I'm on a ventilator every night. I have a sleep apnea.
Sure. Yeah.
What kind of liturgy am I engaged in? I'm really aware of how this thing is shaping my life.
Yeah.
But I'm not aware of how my sleep apnea machine is shaping my life. So I don't know if you could add more to help me kind of see what I'm not yet seeing.
I need to think about that, John. That's a very good point. I do need to think about that. But I'll give you other kinds of examples that I think are useful. I took up running about 5 or 6 years ago. A lot of this aging was getting to me, and I have to be healthy, right? But I started noticing the terrain a lot differently than when I was in a car. So gentle undulations in a car are just easy to get over, right? They don't even recognize, don't even see them. They just kind of disappear into the horizon. And yet when I'm running up this slow ingrain for even just 1/10 of a mile, you feel it, right? So the technology of the car itself is filtering the world for me in certain kinds of ways. Okay. Now, I suspect that those are subtle, and some of them are more stark than others. So maybe the ventilator in the ICU is a stark, different thing than the ventilator that keeps your airway open for your sleep apnea. But I wonder if you could phenomenologically just describe, are you getting better sleep? Does the machine keep you awake? Does the hum of the machine actually put you more into a deeper sleep? I mean, I bet there are phenomenologically subtle things that you see differently, or you imagine differently, or you engage differently as you kind of reflect on that. And so what I would say is that there are subtle ways this happens. Sometimes they're stark, like a ventilator, and sometimes they're not. They're subtle, more subtle. And so I would suspect that those are just more subtle ways of thinking about it. And if something comes up on the horizon such that everybody is on them and suddenly we start to become forgetful of what it was like to be without them, I mean, that's the part that I think shapes our imagination, or the imaginary, I should say.
Thank you, that was very helpful.
Your comment?
Robert. Sorry.
Robert up here.
Just a small point in relation to Heidegger. I thought I heard you saying at the beginning that in the modern technological world, we we're no longer conscious that we're beings unto death. Was I hearing that right?
I think we've become less conscious of that in time.
Yeah, I think I want to emphasize the other side of it, which is that I think all of the time, after childhood at least, we're deeply aware of our beings unto death. Every time you ask someone their age, every time you meet someone, pre-consciously you're assessing,
Sure.
Are they male, are they female, are they
Good
good
point.
looking, not good looking, are they young, are they old? Okay? We do that pre-consciously. And all of these things, the way that we hold ourselves on the street, many other things, are ways that we're conscious that we're beings unto death.
Yeah.
Now, we may not have thematized it to ourselves at that particular moment, but actually all of that undergirds a deep fear of death, and precisely that
Yeah.
usually technology is addressing.
That's very good, Robert. Thank you for pointing that out. There was a Canadian theologian named Arthur C. McGill who makes a similar sort of point, and he says that we worship what we fear, and the title of the book is called Death and Life, an American Theology, and he does not mean Canadian when he says that. He means United States American. And so he says we worship what we fear, and as Americans we fear death, and so at every step of the way, every little thing that reminds us of death we try to squelch. We put Grecian formula, something to get rid of the Botox. One of my students, she went to a dermatologist to see about a mole she had. She was worried that it might be precancerous. And the dermatologist was like, it's nothing. It was not. It wasn't pre-malignant, it wasn't malignant. But she said, it's nothing to worry about. But you've got smile lines. We need to get some Botox now so that you won't have wrinkles later. Right? So in a way, you're exactly right. It is there, but I wonder if it just operates subconsciously. It's kind of also a forgetfulness of death at the same time. But there's in Heidegger, there is this idea that it's something that is also forgotten. I mean, it's both there, but it's also suppressed in a certain way.
Neil.
Just a moment, thank you.
So, Neil Messer, University of Winchester. So, Jeff, thank you. I found your contrast of the two imaginaries and the liturgics that go with them quite compelling. But I was wondering about the practices that fit with each, and I was thinking in particular that the people who will feel this most acutely are healthcare practitioners who are Christian believers, particularly if they also happen to be theologians. That might intensify their experience of the contrast between the two. And I'm wondering if you can say in a bit more fully how this might actually cash out for a Christian believer, maybe even a Christian theologian who's also a healthcare practitioner, who's kind of obliged to to inhabit a world that is shaped by the technological imaginary and the liturgies that go with that. I mean, you talk about chaplains as having to be prophets, not just pastors. Fair enough. So what's that going to mean, and what's that going to mean for other people who inhabit the healthcare system? I mean, how do you live this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think it's you have to go up with other kinds of practices. A medical student recently said to me that when she goes into the patient's room and puts the lotion on her hands, she's thinking of the priest's washing of his hands before he engages in divine liturgy, before saying the words of consecration. And so there's a way in which an alternative, something that's doing something completely different now becomes part of a liturgical pause, so that now she has to, and thinking of that, her imagination is activated in such a way that she might be able to perceive it differently. Or to say a little prayer that I'm now entering onto holy ground, and maybe I need to take my shoes off. Or, as I tell my medical students sometimes, in the US we wear white coats a lot, gives us more power. But one of the things I say do is walk in the room, take the coat off, throw it across the chair, and have a seat. That itself is kind of a ritual action that says, you know what, I'm here for you. I'm here to talk. I'm going to spend some time. So I think there are little practices that people can engage in. And God forbid that those practices just become instrumentalized just to get the patient to be better able to like you, that kind of thing. But I hope it is there. People who practice medicine will have these little liturgical pauses that help them kind of perceive differently what is at stake and what is going on. In the ICU, that's harder though, right? In the ITU, it's harder. We call it the ICU in the US. You call it ITU here. It's a bit harder. I mean, that's a machine, and it's running. I think, the actions tend to be, I've seen so many of my colleagues, and I don't practice anymore, so I'm sure I did it when I was in the ITU too. You walk in the room and you look at the monitor, right? Or you look at, the tracking of the blood pressure through the night, the urine output, and you hardly ever touch the patient, and you hardly ever speak to the patient. And so I think people now are learning that, we got to go in, we got to keep talking to the person that's in bed, we have to touch them. I mean, it's got to the point where we trust the machine so much we don't even do physical exams. So I think the liturgy of the physical exam, it's actually probably fundamentally useless in the grand scheme of getting stuff done in the ICU. It's probably useless. You can trust the machines more now than the physical exam. But the liturgy of the physical exam is itself a kind of taking up with the body in a certain way. So there probably are things like that we need to ponder and reflect upon. But thanks, that's a very good question. Yeah. There's a gentleman over here.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering, is it possible for one to argue that technology itself is disposable? And because technology is disposable, it becomes difficult to establish the argument that ontology can be ascribed to technology. So that how do you deal with this possibility of technology? Okay, because then, even if you talk about God, you talk about the uncaused cause. Okay, how God is infinite. But technology is finite. It's disposable. Furthermore, with respect to death, the question, I'm wondering how a prison chaplain who was confronted with the death of prisoners on a daily basis in the prisons where death is abnormal, not normal, and death is perceived as unnatural. Why? Because of the conditions that perpetuate death in the prison system, based on sentencing, etc. For whom death is not a choice for the prisoner, because the prisoner seeks to negate death. It's not a choice. Suicide is not a choice. It's created by conditions. So how do you deal with these? I mean, how do you respond to these kinds of questions?
So technology is, what I heard you say is technology is disposable, it's fluid, it's constantly moving, it's constantly changing, it flits away. I mean, that's partly Stiegler's point, is that it is perpetually changing, so it's perpetual becoming. And it has no sense of essence to it whatsoever. And in part, I think this is why I turn to liturgy, is because in liturgy, that is the moment where I encounter God in the flesh, okay, in God's transcendent position, right? That's where the universal, the transcendent one becomes highly particularized. And so God is that eternal that is there, and that's why I emphasize liturgy. I don't know that I have an answer to the question about the person in prison that has no option for death, except maybe to say that Giorgio Agamben talks about the way in which there are certain members of society that get set outside the limits of what the law, because of their action, they get set outside the protections of the law itself. And they occupy what he calls a kind of no man's land. And it becomes homo sacer, is what he calls it. The man who cannot be killed and yet may be killed at any moment. So it's sort of the man that cannot die because he stayed outside, or has no agency whatsoever. He's no longer a man, essentially, in that state of exception. And so I don't know. I think people smarter than me who know that world, I think, should do some serious reflection on that very question, that very problem that you've named.
Thank you, I really enjoyed that. I'm Catherine Mannix, and I'm a palliative care physician in Britain. I recognise the sacerdotal procession that I took part in as I moved around the hospital with my team. I recognise that we are called upon when times are troubled because we're comfortable in trouble. And I hadn't really, until you said it, realised the prophetic nature of that piece of work. We take the comfort of the safety of the intensive care unit and we disrupt it in order to enable a safe and better dying. And it is a very, very sacred task.